have you seen in your portfolio recently that like Outbound is a good channel that startups can rely on?
Yeah, it really depends on the category that you're building in, because there's a lot of spaces that are very crowded today. But I think what consistently stands out is having a personalized touch when you're being intentional about how you're crafting your sequences, thinking about the ICP you're targeting, maybe even the specific organization itself or the buyer that you're targeting. I've seen Outbound very effective where someone actually knows, for instance, that I'm a very avid runner, for instance, because I posted about that on Twitter in the past, and they've reached out, offered to buy me a coffee, maybe even like meet at like a favorite running store. I've also seen instances where, I've just been kind of blanketed with a lot of like non-personalized touches throwing features at me. And I think that in today's age, it's more important than ever to really, first of all, understand who you're prospecting into. And second, take a little bit of time for the specific accounts that you have high value in to understand how you basically can get in either through a core champion or maybe even different parts of an organization so you get forwarded on. I often think that, when particularly prospecting into the middle market and enterprise, that you have to assume that not just if someone is opening your email, that they're potentially even forwarding it on to other people in an organization. So crafting it for that message of not just the individual, but also how your solution aligns to the specific needs of the account that you're prospecting into. In today's age, I've seen actually very effective.
Hi, and welcome to the Optimize podcast. My name is Nate Matherson, and I am your host. On this weekly podcast, we typically sit down with some of the smartest minds in content marketing and SEO, but this episode is a unique one. Today, I'm thrilled to sit down with Stephan Cizmar. Stephan is a co-founder and partner at Blackhorn Ventures, an operator-led venture fund. Stephan is also an operating partner at Blackhorn Ventures, and before that, Stephan was the co-founder and chief strategy officer of Lang. On this week's episode, Stephan and I venture deeper into the world of growth and go-to-market. Specifically, we chat about standing up outbound sales motions, building an outbound team, measuring success, and a heck of a lot more. Thanks for listening to this week's episode of the Optimize podcast. It's brought to you by Positional. If you don't know by now, my name's Nate, and I'm one of the co-founders of Positional, and we've built what I think is a pretty awesome tool set for content marketing and SEO teams. We've got tools for keyword research, internal linking, content optimization, and even a couple tools for analytics. We'd love for you to check it out at positional.com. Stephan, thanks so much for coming on this week's episode of the Optimize podcast.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me, Nate. It's great to be on the podcast, and I love listening to your show, and I'm excited to be here.
Well, I've been looking forward to this all week. It's not that I don't love content marketing and SEO, but we've talked about content marketing and SEO for most of the last 50 plus episodes of this podcast. But, there's a lot more to growth and go to market than just content and SEO. And a lot of the listeners of this podcast are, as they're building, hopefully, content and SEO channels, standing up outbound sales channels and outbound sales motions. And you and I have chatted in the past about building an outbound sales motion. And I'm excited to unpack some of the learnings that you've had on the operator side of things and also on the investor side of things. But first, for our listeners, how did you get here and what do you do?
Yeah. So it's great to be on the show. And by way of introduction, my name's Stephan. My background is somewhat, I guess, unique and haphazard into coming into investing. I'm almost like an accidental investor of sorts. I started my career in management consulting, quickly learned that I didn't want to be a management consultant. And actually, instead of going to business school at the dismay of my parents, decided to start a company. Lesson in that process was so fulfilling. Despite the company not getting anywhere, we raised a pre-seed round, ended up folding up the company. It was still such a rapid entry into entrepreneurship and the concept of taking an idea -1 to 0 and then to 0 to 1. And a lot of that actually informed what I became today. From that point, I actually went, when I folded up my first company, over to an early stage startup at the time called Gext here in New York. I joined really sub 150 employees and scaled that company for about 6 years. And I often say that I worked 7 jobs in 6 years, primarily in the biz ops function. But I did everything from standing up a product team to basically doing competitive intel, product marketing, a lot of growth activities. And effectively was like an inside entrepreneur working for the founders and the management team, really from early days, like sub 40 million ARR all the way to an IPO. And by the time that I actually left, we were around like 350 in terms of revenue. And so a lot of rapid growth, and also had a lot of lessons and made a lot of mistakes along the way. It was actually during that time that I started angel investing. And really at the time, it was more so myself, a few friends in the X ecosystem sharing deal flow. That organically snowballed into now what is Lormer today, which is fundamentally a collective of operators and founders, and really now a fund behind it that are backing like-minded individuals, building in categories that we understand. And a lot of the ethos of really Lormer itself is that how can we bottle and really advise founders on really that scaling process of 0 to 10, and frankly, just help them try to not make the same mistakes we made when we were building.
And for all of our listeners, know that Stephan and the Lormer team are investors in Positional. They've been one of our favorite investors to work with, and just so helpful. And I mean that. Most venture investors aren't that helpful. The memes are true, but Stephan has always been there and has been a great partner for us over the years. And just a little bit more context, Stephan and the Lormer team actually invested in our company before we pivoted to Positional. Some of the listeners might know this, but we spent about like 2 years building something else before we started working on Positional. And it's been great working with Stephan and the Lormer team over the last few years throughout the pivot and now onto Positional. But before we did the pivot, we were talking, you and I, a lot about, outbound sales motions. Previously, I was in like a developer tool space, and often like doing outbound in a developer space is quite challenging. You and I kind of chatted through that. And at the time, a couple of years ago, you shared what was like a playbook with me. It was like a 90-page PDF. We actually just referenced it the other day of like how to stand up an outbound sales motion. And I want to talk more about that on this week's episode. But first I have to ask, is outbound dead?
No, I think actually the right type of outbound is more important than ever. We know, and I hear it every day from founders and operators in the tech ecosystem, that inboxes are getting flooded with more outreach than ever before. But I do think that there is still value in personalized touches, a human interaction when prospecting, and also the value of content, social proof. Automation has like kind of been able to spam inboxes rapidly. But at the same time, I think that organizations, leaders in companies are still looking for that human touch and that social proof when determining to make a purchase, but also at the same time when interacting with other organizations and vendors that they're potentially transacting with.
Yeah, people say SEO is dead. I think really crappy content as like an SEO strategy is dead. Like that used to work. But like, I guess the same could be said with like an outbound sales email, like really crappy outbound sales emails. That probably doesn't work. But if you craft what is a really compelling email or touch point with that prospect, then I think it can work. And have you seen in your portfolio recently that like outbound is a good channel that startups can rely on?
Yeah, it really depends on the category that you're building in, because there's a lot of spaces that are very crowded today. But I think what consistently stands out is having a personalized touch when you're being intentional about how you're crafting your sequences, thinking about the ICP you're targeting, maybe even the specific organization itself or the buyer that you're targeting. I've seen outbound very effective where someone actually knows, for instance, that I'm a very avid runner, for instance, because I posted about that on Twitter in the past, and they've reached out, offered to buy me a coffee, maybe even like meet at like a favorite running store. I've also seen instances where, I've just been kind of blanketed with a lot of like non-personalized touches throwing features at me. And I think that in today's age, it's more important than ever to really, first of all, understand who you're prospecting into. And second, take a little bit of time for the specific accounts that you have high value in to understand how you basically can get in either through a core champion or maybe even different parts of an organization so you get forwarded on. I often think that, when particularly prospecting into the middle market and enterprise, that you have to assume that not just if someone is opening your email, that they're potentially even forwarding it on to other people in an organization. So crafting it for that message of not just the individual, but also how your solution aligns to the specific needs of the account that you're prospecting into. In today's age, I've seen actually very effective.
High level, are there certain industries where like outbound is more challenging than others? Is that something you've seen?
Yeah, I mean, within the Lorimer portfolio, we invest across really what we call six core verticals. That ranges from everything logistics, energy to supply chain, developer tools, future of work. Um, I've seen again, like organizations from an outbound standpoint, sometimes struggle with certain channels, let's say like digital channels, email, LinkedIn, in really laggard industries. So think about like logistics, manufacturing. Typically, the most effective touch points and outreach is usually a phone call or just showing up at a factory or at a port if you can. Um, and the other side of it too is like within crowded spaces where there's a lot of outbound activity, like developer tools, for instance. That's where again digital channels are effective if you have the right touch points, the right cadence, the right messages to align to your end buyer. Fundamentally, though, I think that like this notion of outbound being dead is really a misnomer. Outbound is not dead, and there's still a lot of companies transacting with that first touch entry point from an outbound channel. It really is, I think, cutting through the noise. And how do you stand out and differentiate, not just in your market, but with your competition, and also leave something that lingers in someone's mind?
Well, I want to dig into messaging in about 2 minutes. But first, I want to ask for the founders listening to this podcast, when does it make sense to start an outbound motion? Should it be something that, like, on day one, we're sending emails and picking up the phone, or is it something we start to worry about 1 or 2 years in? What have you seen?
I think it typically starts when you have really an MVP and you're starting to enter your design phase. Typically, what we see with companies building is that they have like a close network of design partners so they could start getting an early product into people's hands. And I think oftentimes that motion of starting to build with your design partners is a good time to also start experimenting with some outbound touches, partially because this will help refine your ICP, but also at the same time, a lot of the responses that you do get talking to additional customers and potential users will help refine a lot of the product improvements as you move from design phase really to full commercialization and effectively a public launch. But typically, I think in terms of time scale, we see companies having most effective kind of learnings from outbound, really starting when they're ready, like I would say, to start with the public launch. Really, a couple months before that to further validate the persona, the ICP, really refine the messaging. Oftentimes, I'll advise founders in those early stages, let's say pre-seed and seed, to actually start emailing, outreaching to potential users, potential partners, really start helping refine that product development lifecycle, but also at the same time funneling some of those learnings into what could start to form really the go-to-market motion early as you're going from 0 to 1.
And in the very beginning, is it usually the founders that are standing up this motion, or can they like outsource it? Can they hire like a BDR like fairly early?
I wouldn't recommend that you start outsourcing or even hiring a BDR until you're comfortable as a founder with the messaging and the positioning yourself. And thanks to, again, the wonderful tools out there like Outreach and Apollo, SalesLoft, there's now a plethora of tools that are rather inexpensive for an early stage company to actually start automating some of that process. But it also goes back to how you're articulating the value prop of what you're building, the personalization that you're adding to your sequences, and ensuring, again, that you're punchy, because typically a lot of outbounds is actually disqualified at the subject line. So how can you basically have something that's catchy, that catches someone's eye, prompts them to open an email, and then from there hooking them within that first sentence? And so there's a lot of lessons learned from this. This is not just a go-to-market exercise, but really I think it helps really start refining a lot of the product itself.
Yeah, I'm sure that a lot of those learnings would be transferable to the website or to other marketing materials. And I do want to talk about messaging a little bit. As far as like the message goes. If it's an email, we've got a subject line, we've got body copy. Let's start first with like subject lines. What makes for a good subject line?
It varies again. I've seen some where first name is used in subject line. I've seen others where, it's something like not related to the product, but something catchy like coffee on us, perhaps. But I think this is again where the power of experimentation and rapid iteration comes in, where thanks to a lot of the sequencing tools today, the outbound tools, you could actually rapidly iterate based on open rates and click rates and responses, really what's working for your particular segment. I think oftentimes leading with either a solution or a problem statement of what you're trying to solve could be effective, whether that's in the subject line or the first sentence, but really like trying to, again, convey value rapidly in a digestible snippet early in the touch.
And I've always struggled with the ask. Like, what do I ask for in one of these messages? Do I ask someone to get on a call? Do I ask them to go to my website? Do I just try to get them to respond without asking them anything? Like, what should I be looking to get with like that first touch? Maybe it's an email.
It's a fantastic question, but I think it really varies on the category you're building in. For instance, like if you're in developer tools, let's say doing top down or evangelizing, let's say even like a PLG motion supported by Outbound, typically it's like a lot of engineering and product leaders don't want to interact with a sales rep. They rather see documentation, some sort of case study, use cases on a website. But if you're more of a top down enterprise motion, let's say selling it in the application layer, the call to action should be, can we get on the phone to discuss? Would you like to see a demo? I think it's like something compelling where you're empowering them to basically take the action to follow up. And once you then get that organization on the phone, that's when really you could develop your pitch, but also again, start building that relationship with a potential buyer, or at the very least get validation on what you're building. So you can either qualify or disqualify that segment or that persona type.
I know we're talking about emails specifically. A question I always have is, how often should I follow up? Like, I get the emails where, there's the sixth email on the email chain and it just doesn't look right when it lands in my inbox, but I assume we need to follow up. Like, is that a best practice? Should we be following up on these messages?
Yeah, I think typically we advise at Lormer founders to really run sequences between 7 to 10 touches when they're first starting to iterate, but that's across multiple channels. So typically it would be like a sequence where first touch is an email, maybe again, trying to build rapport, evangelize a value proposition or a solution to a burning problem. Then maybe it's a LinkedIn ad that counts as a touch. Then basically from there, perhaps it's a phone call. And with a lot of the tools today, you could actually automate the sequences, maybe every 2 to 3 days, having a touch through a different channel. But ultimately, I think that what we've seen is that don't give up. I mean, people are still responding on the 7th, 8th email. Persistence pays off, but it also gives you, again, more data to continue refining your value propositions. If you see people dropping off in a sequence, or let's say they're more responsive with a phone call after an open, these are all data that you can now collect with these platforms. But it's really, again, tailoring the outreach to the market and the segment that you're trying to attack.
And you mentioned these touch points that are probably more than just email. You mentioned LinkedIn. Maybe they see an ad. You also mentioned potentially calling them. I want to ask you about that specifically. Like, does cold calling still work? Is that something we should be trying?
I actually recently, with a fun tool here at Lormer, purchased a tool actually as a result of a cold call. So personally, I believe cold calling still works, and I think it's a good way. Again, if you could get someone on the phone, worst case scenarios that they don't pick up or they say they don't have time at this point, don't call me back. But best case scenario is that like you have someone where you could, again, within that first 30 seconds, hook them on a compelling value proposition. Maybe it's at the right time, right pain point. We often tell founders too, it's here at Lormer, that really you miss every shot you don't take. And so there's at any given point within your TAM, there's only a small slice of people that are right time, right place in a potential buying cycle for a solution that you're building. But the tricky part about outbound and demand gen is you don't know what percentage of that TAM is in that moment. And so really putting yourself out there, starting to, again, evangelize a concept, making sure that you have the right touch points, the right account list built, the right personas targeted, puts you in a position to, even at the very least, come back, like, let's say in a year, or not at this time. Best case scenario, you're discovering someone who's in the right time, right place that could actually go into a buying cycle. And so I think that as much as you can, as a founder or someone in an early building, like a demand gen and go-to-market team, it's important to make sure that you have, first of all, from a prerequisite, your account list defined, your segmentation of how you're attacking that market, and also the value propositions that, again, from a hypothesis standpoint, you think will resonate with the buyers that you're targeting. And this is all something that's kind of constantly evolving. Go-to-market readiness and go-to-market fit is not something that's much like product market fit. It's not something that's stagnant. It's constantly evolving, and value propositions change as you basically build the product. So it's really just how do you effectively set up the right infrastructure for both the account side and the persona side? And then simultaneously, how are you basically setting up the right processes to measure what's working and what's not?
If we don't yet know like who is that persona we want to target, are we too early for like an outbound motion, or is it expected that we're going to like need to iterate in terms of like that organization on like who is the right person for us to actually try to contact?
I think when building in like that early pre-seed phase, you have to have some hypothesis as to who could potentially be a buyer, or at least at the department level, the value proposition of the core user or the core beneficiary of your product itself. But I do think that that's critical going into it, because you can't just like email an entire company. For instance, let's say if you're targeting the enterprise, you can't just email everyone from like HR, facilities to IT. If you're building, let's say, an enterprise tool specifically for one of those. Simultaneously, I do think that it's also important to be agile, where within any given buying situation, this is for top-down go-to-markets, you often have one champion, but then there could be multiple influencers from different departments, maybe even different from reporting structures and org charts. And so having some of that variability built into your sequences, I think, is, first of all, critical in evangelizing the value prop that you're trying to get out there. But second, you should have, with the proper measurement, be able to see actually what's working and start validating your hypothesis of how to get into that organization. We see some companies within the portfolio that start thinking that they need to basically target heads of departments. But then what they find, again, through this process of iteration and as they start refining their go-to-market motion, is that actually going through a champion, let's say an analyst or an individual user, who then takes it to maybe their superior for budget authority or budget approval, is a more effective means of getting into an organization. And so again, these are things that we often advise founders that you don't know, but you have to have some sort of at least initial hypothesis as to the segment you're targeting, the department in which is getting value from your product, and again, what is some general messaging and positioning early on that you think would resonate based on the value proposition you're building as a company.
Really tactical question. Is it okay for us to hit like multiple potential buyers within like an org? Like I can send an email to the analyst and the analyst boss, and that's okay.
Yes. And oftentimes even mixing in not just with email, but calls to both as well. And this is, again, like ideally is done founder-led in early days. And the learnings that you go through kind of in that 0 to 1 journey as you get to go-to-market readiness should be, again, documented, measured, so that, first of all, it validates against the value proposition and the marketing and the positioning of the product. But I think also equally as important is that a lot of these lessons, when documented, eases that first kind of commercial or BDR hire that you bring into an organization. And typically the order of operations that we advise companies, and keep in mind, this is preface for top-down go-to-market motions where you're targeting a buyer and basically going through a sales cycle, is that we often advise that it's more important for founders to stay in market, typically from that first million in ARR. But you could also bring in a BDR once you have confidence in what the motion looks like to get in. And that's when a lot of these lessons learned during the founder prospecting days should be documented and then basically passed on to that early BDR hire.
Probably a stupid question, but is it a BDR or is it an SDR? Like I always like interchange them and I use them as the same. Are we hiring like a BDR or an SDR?
It's funny. I mean, like BDR is a term that I use, but I think SDR is interchangeable. I've seen some organizations call BDRs as an outbound motion. Sometimes they'll have it segmented with a different role, SDR for inbound nurture. That's like really what the nuance there. But again, that's deep in the weeds. I think it's interchangeable, really. But fundamentally, what we're defining over here is an individual whose job it is to basically build rapport, prospect out to accounts, and really start warming up that top of funnel and migrate it from awareness all the way down into the consideration phase, where then you could bring in either an AE or a founder.
So at this point in this conversation, like the founder has, they've experimented, they've refined that value prop. Maybe there's like an early sense that it's working, or maybe like you said, they've hit $1 million in annualized revenue or ARR, and they're ready to start like building a team around like an outbound motion. My first question is it better to hire 2 BDRs at once? I know I've heard that on Twitter. Is that actually a thing?
Again, it depends on the organization. I'm actually a fan of that. What it does is it creates a little bit healthy competition. Also, again, more capacity for wider surface area to start attacking. But the prerequisite, even before bringing that individual in or that group of those 2 people, is you have to have some certainty that, again, the messaging, the value proposition, the segment, the persona, that you have certainty that what you're building is resonating within that kind of cascading group of categories. But specifically, I do think that if you have the cash and the runway to do so, starting with 2 is a very effective means, because you also can watch and facilitate collaboration and partnership between those 2 BDRs, early BDRs, in addition to having, again, capacity once you basically feel that you have the go-to-market readiness.
And now just a quick word from one of our sponsors, actually our only sponsor. That is Positional.com. Positional has what I think is an awesome tool set for content marketers. We've got everything you need to take you from start to finish and help you scale this channel, as I've done over the last 11 years of my career. We'd love for you to check it out at Positional.com. I've always found it really challenging to hire BDRs because from my view, there's not a lot to go off of. Like I'm typically like talking to folks who might be, 21 years old. It's like their first job or maybe their second job. They don't have a lot of experience. They've probably never been a BDR before in a lot of cases, and they're applying for this role. And I've found it really hard to know like how to hire for a BDR when there's not a lot of signal that like you can point to. Like what have you found like important when kind of screening for a BDR hire? Like how do you find a good BDR? I guess is what I'm asking.
At Lang, when I was building the growth team, we just screen for grit, regardless of what background you're in. It's like, do you have resilience to consistently, make calls, emails, pick up the phone and make dials, and also at the same time, creativity. Can you find different ways to get in front of organizations? That could be whether it's phone calls to again a large buying organization, or even maybe sending like a personalized touch, for instance, like a handwritten note to a potential buyer or prospect that you're prospecting into. But you're right; it's very hard to screen. Oftentimes, individuals in these roles are maybe fresh out of college or 1 or 2 years into their career. But fundamentally, I think as like a base requirement, you need creativity and resilience, and really just like a generally positive attitude to push into this, because a lot of the energy you convey when prospecting can be picked up by the person you're interacting with. And so I think that's also like there's an etiquette, kind of like a bedside manner that's also required, or refinement, but that's also learned over time. The other area that I think is interesting is that there's organizations out there that similar to like code boot camps, like FlockJ, for instance, that now have organizations where people who want to get into tech and commercial and sales roles could go through these prospecting boot camps. And so I do advise founders sometimes when you do have certainty on, again, the prerequisite required for go-to-market readiness, looking at some of these organizations that are doing reskilling programs for outbound training. I've actually had some success using those in the past as well.
Yeah, I think you told me about one in the past. Do you want to give them like a shout out? I totally forget their name.
It is FlockJ. And so it's quick plug over here. It's an organization where they help with reskilling, basically people who want to enter tech, typically from non-traditional backgrounds. So for instance, maybe you're like a nurse practitioner, you're thinking about moving into tech, or you worked, let's say, coming from the military. And I've had great success with them and their program. And it's on par again with on the engineering side of the house, like some of these code boot camps and like General Assembly, for instance, that are out there.
And once we've hired like this first BDR, this maybe two at a time, we've got them here. That playbook, we should already have that playbook for them by the time they start working, I'd assume, right?
I typically advise founders, like it's important to have, I guess, at a base minimum, a definition of an ICP. So what is your ideal customer profile? What are the characteristics does that look like? It could be on a specific segment, a size of a company, maybe a geo, for instance, or even like, a amount of funding raised. Second is, I think, having an understanding of the persona. So how I often talk and explain this to founders and early go-to-market teams is the individual that you're prospecting into, your main champion, once you've identified that, what keeps them up at night? What gets them hired in the first place? What does their day-to-day look like, even outside of what the company and the value prop you're building? What gets them fired? What gets them promoted? Can you understand that? And then can you reverse engineer that individual's day-to-day to how the value proposition of what you're building benefits them? How does what you're building, the software you're building, make their lives 10x easier? How does it save time? And from an organizational standpoint, how are you making an existing process better, cheaper, faster, more efficient? And this is like at a base case, like this is the prerequisites and the foundation of what transitions into effective go-to-market outbound. Because really you're trying to understand how then you basically take the value propositions of what you're building and plugging it into the day-to-day of the user or the champion that you're targeting.
As we have these BDRs, we've got the playbook. They've started sending emails and making calls and sending LinkedIn emails. How do we measure success that it's working? I guess like what's the KPI we need to look at?
I think open rates and responses. Responses is kind of like the top metric. And I also think, again, like looking at the metrics based on different sequences. How do you measure effectively? Maybe a first touch with a call is more effective than, let's say, an email. Or maybe there's a specific piece of content that is resonating. I think social proof also in today's age of selling is very important. So I often also advise founders, it's not just having the BDR playbook ready, but at least having like some sort of customer testimonial or success story highlighting the value proposition, maybe of an early user, a key power user or adopter, or even maybe some of the success from the design phase, and also ensuring that you have like punchy value stats, ROI, on how your platform, again, makes someone's life better, cheaper, faster. What is the percentage that average on savings? How is it this particular process is being made faster or cheaper? These are all key value propositions I think are important to weave in.
I guess we can talk about content marketing a little bit on this episode. I've been waiting to ask, but it sounds like having those case studies, that like bottom of the funnel content where like someone is already aware of your product, like they're interested in engaging. That content can be really helpful to a BDR in, showcasing that value prop in that outbound message or in a follow-up or whatever it might be. And so it sounds like as part of the playbook, having all of that content collateral is just going to make the life of like a BDR or an outbound sales team member a lot easier. Does that sound right?
it's empowering them with tools, like more tools in their toolbox, you could say, or in their arsenal. Because if you don't have that, effectively what you're going on is essentially just pestering someone with emails and calls and touches to essentially take a meeting with you. I think sometimes, like, or oftentimes, what we've seen with companies in the early stages that, like, you don't need a complete library, let's say, of multiple success stories. If you just have one referenceable customer that loves your product, that's seeing immense value from it, and you could point to that either at some point in the sequence, also point to it on your website, through your marketing, let's say through your LinkedIn ads, promoted marketing. That, again, from the mindset of a potential buyer or a prospect, kind of puts themselves in the shoes of what it looks like to potentially use your product, or at the very least, gives another compelling angle for them to understand the value proposition by either seeing someone that they compete with, maybe someone they partner with, or maybe someone in a completely different space, but the value that they're getting from that platform and making their lives easier. And I think that's critical in today's age where we are getting inundated by outbound. My inbox is full every morning of companies trying to sell us things. But how do you stand out on that? It's really that social proof. It's really that the power of that content. It's also then that personalization.
Yeah, and it feels like all of the work you might do on like the content marketing side of things, beyond just creating the content to enable the rep, is going to make the rep's job a lot easier. Like we had, Nate Matherson on a recent podcast episode, and he does a lot of B2B SEO, and he basically said, like, yes, we could rank first for a given keyword, but if no one's ever heard of your company or your brand before, there's still going to probably be a low likelihood that they're going to convert. And so if, we're posting on LinkedIn or we're creating content, and naturally potential buyers are seeing us organically, by the time they get an outbound message from us, they're probably going to be a lot more likely to engage, right?
Yes. And I think it's the two go hand in hand. Like this is something that we started building when I was at Lang, and even before that, when I was working with the marketing team at Yext. Is like, how can you basically align your outbound touches with also a lot of indirect marketing and content marketing? And with today's age, the beauty of a lot of tools out there, for instance, like LinkedIn, is that you could have a sequence uploaded into your outbound content or HubSpot or Salesforce instance, and from there be targeting specific individuals that you were prospecting with targeted ads, let's say on LinkedIn. And that's typically a really good time to use a case study, or it's like, hey, here's how we saved X organization Y percentage of cost, or made them more effective. And kind of having that kind of groundswell around your buyers. Like, I'm not saying, like, again, to swarm them completely, but ensuring that your brand is showing up everywhere where they are, in their inbox, also on their LinkedIn feed, maybe even on targeted advertisements. I think it's critical, just because you don't know really holistically what could actually be that tipping point for someone to pick up the phone or respond to an email and get in touch with you.
Totally. And I'm curious about like the handoff. So like, say the rep, has booked a meeting with a potential client. And this again is probably a stupid question, but does like the BDR take that first meeting by themselves, or do they very quickly loop in the founder or an AE? Like, what does that like handoff process typically look like?
Typically, what we see is companies, like in the early stage, will have that handoff actually usually a first call joint with the BDR and the founder or an AE, for two reasons. One is that BDR is the first touch point, that organization that the prospect is interacted with. It's nice to have that continuity. But second, a lot of the role of the BDR is an entry point into a sales and go-to-market organization, where these individuals often will graduate into a customer success or AE role. And so kind of starting that early, having them learn from an AE or the founder, is really critical. And when we think about career advancement, but also at the same time, the constant education that goes on within a sales organization. What we often advise is that typically with that first touch, the BDR should prepare some light notes, let's say saying like, this person responded, this is the account name, this is how many, let's say the particular email or sequence they responded to, and then take that first call with the AE. but the AE is the one building rapport. And then from that point on, AE or founder, if there's a founder-led sales, and having them then hand off the account after that first touch.
And another very tactical question for all the founders listening to this podcast: when we're hiring like a BDR to facilitate this outbound motion, like what percentage of their comp should be based on like success? Because my understanding is that like they probably have their base comp, and then they have like a comp structure based on the number of meetings that are qualified that they set up. So I assume that's right, but like what percentage of the comp should be performance based versus base?
I mean, I think it ranges, but typically it should be around like 20 to 30% on variable comp. I think what's even critical too, from a tactical standpoint, is like when hiring that first BDR or pair of BDRs, having a clear definition of what that sales qualified lead or market qualified lead looks like, and ensuring, again, a proper ramp. I think a lot of founders sometimes slip where they think that hiring someone within the first month, they're going to have basically peak performance. You really have to think of what that incremental ramp looks like. Someone coming on, getting enabled with the value proposition. And often what we see is it takes 3 to 4 months before you're fully up to speed. Just knowing, again, how to sell, position the product. And that's typically, that ramp should be built into a comp plan. And what we also advise too is that we should also incentivize overperformance. So maybe there's some sort of kicker on, let's say, going over quota on like an SQL total on a monthly basis to further incentivize, again, stretching for that goal.
That makes so much sense. Ramping this higher into that 3-4 month ramp period, so that way like they don't get discouraged from a comp standpoint in like the very beginning. But if they are very successful right away, having that kicker there to reward them makes a ton of sense to me. Again, another very tactical question: who qualifies the meeting? Is that like, does the AE say, okay, this was a qualified lead or a qualified meeting, or does the BDR do that, or does some sales manager person do that? Who does that?
In the early stage, I think it has to be out of the BDR's hand to qualify. So it's like, again, going back to that central definition, like, is this account in a buying cycle that could transact at some point where they basically want to take a meeting? And does this lead basically to an opening and opportunity in CRM? That's often how we see kind of the SQL definition, again, in very like high level terms. But that qualification should be done by someone that's not the BDR. You don't want self-dealing. And again, you don't want to incentivize that. So typically that's either like a founder, if they're still doing founder-led sales, or like a sales manager, frontline manager, or an AE. In larger organizations, you have like, with BDR pods, what we typically see, meaning that maybe it's like a 2-to-1 or 3-to-1 ratio of BDRs supporting, let's say, a group of AEs. In those instances, you would have typically like an outbound or demand gen manager as the individual who's qualifying the leads coming in. And this is also to say that not every lead is also made equal. Sometimes you'll have a touch or an outbound. The individual picks up the phone. They said, like, this is very interesting, but let's say come back in like 6 months from now. What we often see with those, like, still give the credit for an SQL, but also enter that into a drip campaign where you're basically either having them on an email alias or making sure that you're following up with the requisite touch to keep them warm, so when they're ready to transact, you're top of mind for them.
Totally. And I have to ask, like, as an investor, I'm sure you've seen all of the like new AI BDR tools. Like, they claim to replace humans. Is that going to happen? Like, is an AI tool just going to replace the need to have like actual humans running this process?
I don't think so. I mean, like, we've looked at a few of these. I think at a minimum, a lot of the tools on the market today augment the effectiveness of human teams, but I think there's still value in when an individual or a prospect, let's say, wants to interact with an organization, having a real human behind the phone call or the Zoom just goes so much further than having, again, a bot or some sort of chatbot spamming someone's inbox. And I'm not to say this is not like bearish on that category of tools. I think they're very effective. But I do think, again, that like with something as like, selling is a very personal and relationship oriented exercise. And I think it's critical to have that human touch within your sales process and go to market strategy.
Yeah, I totally agree. And, from the investor standpoint, I can't imagine like many of these companies are going to be successful. It's probably going to be a graveyard because you'd think if like it does work like fundamentally as a technology, like wouldn't it be like the HubSpots of the world, like the Salesforces of the world, the Apollos of the world that like are actually going to like enable this like technology for their customers and not like a new standalone tool that might integrate with them? Do you think that's fair?
I think that the incumbents are really in pole position to either build or acquire this technology, like an Outreach, for instance, or even a HubSpot. Largely because too that there's heuristics and demographics that you need to train these models on to get into these organizations, and these larger incumbents are sitting on that data. And so I do think that again, like this category is evolving very quickly, but as it stands right now, I do think that there's a lot of interesting innovation coming out of it. But I do think that this is something that an incumbent ultimately will own.
This has been so much fun, Stephan. And if it's okay with you, I've got a bunch of lightning round questions. Does that sound good?
I'm ready for it. Yeah.
So, deliverability, like I've heard it's more challenging than it used to be. Are there like one or two things we just need to keep in mind from an email deliverability standpoint?
Oh yeah, I would be wary. As a rule of thumb, never have attachments on emails, especially when entering your sequence. Even hyperlinks sometimes could be sensitive. So make sure that if you're linking out to a case study, for instance, or pointing someone to a website, that you're doing it in select places on the email itself. And there's also a suite of tools that empower organizations to ensure that their inboxes are warm. So like Glock apps, for instance, is a platform out there that shows your deliverability if you're blacklisted on any sort of listservs. I also recommend to founders as they're starting to build their outbound motions that they're also making sure that their inboxes are warm and that the deliverability remains high, and continue monitoring that.
And we shouldn't be sending these emails from like our primary email that we use day to day, right? We should have like dedicated emails and inboxes to support the outbound motion.
Correct. There's a stack that you need that's separate from your core inbox. And that could be maybe like a slightly different URL. But it's critical that you keep them segmented because, again, your deliverability is ultimately impacted by the volume of what you're sending, the types of emails you're sending. If you're basically getting sent to a spam inbox, it's really critical to monitor that.
Speaking of tool stacks, you've mentioned a few on this episode. You've mentioned Apollo, SalesLoft, one or two other tools. If we were like starting this motion from scratch today, but we've got capital to invest in good tools, like what does the ideal tool stack look like when you're getting started?
Early stage, like you need starting really with some sort of list and data feed. So that could be like a Zoom info. If you're, again, a little bit of a larger organization, 6sense also is very powerful. And ensuring that again, that you're identifying your account list, your prospects, your personas in those accounts with a tool. And then from there, having the email list either through, again, a Zoom info, Apollo, HubSpot, through a sequencing stack. Outreach, SalesLoft also are very effective. And making sure that you're tightly integrated with your CRM. A lot of these are one-click integrations, but I think it's critical that the accounts that you're reaching out to and that are in your sequences are also logged in your CRM. And also having, I think, a process set up where you understand the amount of touches you're starting with the sequences itself, what kind of campaigns look like after you reach the end of those sequences, and also how do you keep prospects warm. Oftentimes, as I said, like it's a very small aperture of the actual number of accounts that are in market ready to buy a solution at that given point. It doesn't mean that they won't transact at some point in the future, but I think it could be a little daunting when you have such a large world or universe of potential buyers. How do you keep them warm and engaged so that when they are ready, that you're top of mind for them?
How soon do we know that it's not working with the BDR? If we've just hired one, like how long do we give them, or how quickly should we know if they're doing a good job?
It's a great question. I think there's so many variables. I mean, you have to look at open rates. You have to look at like the content that you're leveraging. You have to look at the positioning of your sequences of your emails. I think typically you should know things are working or not within the first, let's say, 4 months, first quarter, 3 to 4 months. But oftentimes it could be, again, the the content you're leveraging. It could be the channels that you're engaging with. So I often recommend that like this is not something that like there's one set rule and a playbook to follow rigidly. I think that founders, early commercial teams, they need to constantly experiment and iterate and find what is that right mix of both touches, sequencing, messaging, content, so that you're empowering your BDRs to succeed.
What's the biggest deal you've either closed at one of your companies or you've seen closed at a portfolio company from like a cold outbound start?
We closed Subway. I think it was in the mid seven figures, multi-year deal, through an outbound touch, to um, someone in a senior leadership position. So outbound is effective. It could pay off again in the enterprise. It's a very validated means, and I don't think it's going anywhere. But yeah, I've seen multi-million dollars deals closed with outbound.
We talked a little bit earlier about the messaging, that first sentence being so important. And I find myself getting emails like every day now with like AI for blah, 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 or like AI to do this better. Is like the AI hook just like overused at this point or still pretty effective with enterprises who maybe are a little bit dumber, I should say?
It's honestly oversaturated. You have to there's a lot of great AI platforms out there, but I think you have to fundamentally not just like AI or feature or category or description of a product. You have to understand what is the value that you're delivering to a user. And I think that's most critical. It's not that particular feature. It's not just like feature dumping in an email. It really should be, what is the benefit of using your tool versus a different tool or the standard way of doing business, and how you make that process that you're attacking better, cheaper, faster, more efficient.
How can our listeners connect with you or how can they learn more about Lormer?
Feel free to shoot me an email. I'm Stephan at lormerventures.com. I'm also on Twitter, at SJCIZMAR. Yeah, and I'm always looking to interact with founders. Always happy to share some battle stories, and love the learning journey that this job empowers me to be on.
Well, for all of our listeners, we will include a link back to Lormer in the show notes, as well as a link over to Stephan's Twitter and LinkedIn profiles. So definitely connect with him there. Stephan, thank you so much for coming on this week's episode of the Optimized Podcast.
Thank you, Nate. This was amazing.
And that's a wrap. And I just want to thank our sponsor, Positional. They've got what is a pretty awesome tool set for content marketers and SEOs. They've even got a couple tools for social media. We'd love for you to check out Positional and the tool set that we've created over the last 15 months at positional.com. And you can always reach out to me if you have any questions. My email is nate@positional.com. Whether you've got questions about our tool set or comments and complaints, or even positive feedback about this podcast, I'd love to hear from you. And don't forget to hit the like and subscribe button wherever you are listening to this podcast. Thanks so much for tuning in. Bye.